He wasn't supposed to be there. A moment of childish curiosity pulled Prince Louis toward a half-open door, and within seconds, he stepped into something far darker than he could comprehend. Clarence House had felt ordinary that day, but only on the surface. Behind its polished floors and carefully curated smiles, there was something different, an undercurrent of unease that no one acknowledged aloud. The king was in meetings with senior advisors. William and Catherine had been pulled into quiet, off-the-record discussions about upcoming royal engagements, and Charlotte was with her music tutor in the East Wing. That left Louis, spirited, restless, and sharp-eyed, in the care of a trusted staff member. But the staffer made a mistake just a moment, a quick phone call down the corridor, and that's all it took. A single lapse in attention that opened a door to something no one had prepared Louis to see. He didn't mean to wander. It started with the boredom of waiting, then became a quiet exploration. His footsteps softened by thick carpets. Louis drifted past portraits too tall to identify, old clocks that ticked too slowly. Then, a strange blend of lavender and something sharper, older, metallic. It didn't belong to the hallways he knew. It came from a door slightly ajar, the brass handle dulled with time. There was no sound beyond the doorway, no footsteps, no voices. Just stillness. Louis paused. Part of him knew he shouldn't go further, that this wasn't a place where laughter was welcome or curiosity rewarded. But he was young, he was brave, and more than anything, he was intrigued. With a slow push, the door creaked open, and he stepped inside. What greeted him wasn't loud or shocking at first glance. It was quiet, unmoving. A room frozen in time. Silk shawls draped over chairs. Half-burned candles resting untouched. Picture frames crowding every surface. The air was thick, not with dust, but with memories, like someone had lived there long enough to shape the room around their regrets. It wasn't a guest room. It wasn't even just a sitting room. It felt like something sacred, but also guarded. A place that demanded silence, not reverence. Louis didn't call out. He didn't even breathe loudly. Something in the room commanded him to tread lightly. His eyes scanned the vanity first, drawn by a glint of glass and gold. Dozens of perfume bottles stood like little towers. Some new, most old. But it wasn't the bottles that caught him, it was the letter, half-tucked beneath a crystal dish, sealed, untouched. And written across it, in sharp, deliberate ink, was one word that made Louis's chest tighten. Charlotte. His sister's name. Not written by her. Not in her handwriting. And certainly not in a place where it belonged. The ink was bold, the lines almost too precise. Louis stared. His fingers hovered. There was no reason for it to be here. No reason for it to be sealed, unnamed, hidden. But the letter was only the beginning, because what lay beneath the vanity would reveal something far more devastating. He only meant to look. But a small wooden box tucked under silk scarves would change how Louis saw his family and himself forever. Still frozen in place, Louis stared at the envelope on the vanity. Charlotte's name stared back at him in that deliberate, almost scolding script. His fingers twitched toward it, but something made him hesitate. Not fear, exactly something closer to a weight he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. It wasn't just a letter. It meant something. But before he could touch it, something near the floor caught the corner of his eye. Slightly hidden beneath a draped silk scarf was a box, small, wooden, and barely open. It didn't match the rest of the room's delicate clutter. There was no gold trim, no label, just quiet intent. And Louis, pulled by a force he didn't understand, crouched down and lifted the lid. Inside, he found things that made no sense to him but felt wrong all the same. A handkerchief, yellowing and soft, embroidered with the initials SS. Not royal, not familiar. A photo next, black and white, creased and curling at the corners. A woman stared back at him, someone he didn't recognize, with a gaze that wasn't warm or inviting. It was something else. Distant. Intense. A face that felt out of place, like it didn't belong in the palace. But it was the third item that stopped him cold. A torn piece of paper, jagged along the top edge, clearly ripped from a notebook or journal. It held only a few lines, barely a paragraph, but they hit harder than any photo or monogram ever could. "She'll never be accepted. Not like her. No matter what I do." Louis blinked. Read it again. And again. The handwriting was familiar. That sharp, narrow style. It was the same hand that had written Charlotte's name on the envelope. The realization made his fingers curl inwards. The room no longer felt still. It felt alive, like it had eyes, like it knew he didn't belong there. And suddenly, every instinct told him to leave. With shaking hands, Louis stuffed the envelope into his pocket, not to steal, not to hide, but because something deep inside him screamed that it wasn't safe here. That Charlotte's name didn't belong on something so bitter, so quiet, so cruel. He placed the torn paper back exactly as he'd found it, closed the wooden box, straightened up, and walked out. But as he reached the door, he had the unshakable sense that something was watching. Not a person, not even a ghost, but the room itself. He stepped into the hallway, but the chill from that space followed him. His polished shoes made no sound on the carpet. His heartbeat, however, thundered. Because he hadn't just found a letter. He had stumbled into a secret wrapped in silence and silk, and it had changed him. Back at home, Louis couldn't shake the feeling that the room had followed him, and neither could his mother. He didn't speak a word on the way home, but when Catherine opened the letter Louis found, her hands began to tremble, and a royal wall of silence cracked wide open. From the moment they left Clarence House, Catherine felt something had shifted. Louis, normally chatty, full of mischief and questions, sat in complete silence, his face turned to the window, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. He wasn't sulking. He wasn't sleepy. It was something else, something unspoken that clung to him like a shadow. Catherine noticed it immediately, her maternal instinct screaming that something had happened, but she didn't press. Not then. She waited, patient and watchful, as the city blurred by, unsure of what exactly had taken hold of her son. It wasn't until later that evening, when the house had grown quiet again and the weight of the day had finally settled, that the truth began to show itself. Louis came to her room, slow and uncertain. In his hand was the envelope, creased now, the edges bent where his fingers had gripped it too tightly. He said nothing at first, only held it out to her with eyes that looked older than they had that morning. Catherine took it carefully. The name across the front, Charlotte, sent a cold ripple through her. The handwriting was unmistakably adult, refined and deliberate, not rushed, not careless. Someone had taken time to write this. She looked at Louis, who simply whispered, "Her room." Catherine didn't need to ask which room he meant. The realization hit immediately. He had gone where he shouldn't have. He had seen something that wasn't meant for him or for anyone else. She asked gently, "Do you want me to open it?" Louis nodded once. His hands were clenched now, his knuckles white, his small shoulders drawn in. Catherine broke the seal with slow, cautious fingers. The paper inside was stiff, slightly yellowed, but not from age, from being hidden. She read it once, her breath catching midway. Then again, slower, her eyes narrowing as the message unfolded in chilling layers. The letter didn't name Charlotte directly beyond the envelope, but every line pointed unmistakably to her. It spoke of suitability, of presentation, of the weight of the image. Phrases like unfit for the spotlight and lacking the necessary refinement twisted through the letter like daggers masked as etiquette. It was formal, but cold. Beneath its polite structure lived a quiet cruelty, a judgment meant to wound without raising its voice. Catherine folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling now despite her best efforts to hide it. She didn't want Louis to see her shaken, but he already knew. He had seen it in the room, in the box, in the photograph, and now, in her silence. Why would she write that about Charlotte? He asked, barely above a whisper. The question hung heavy between them. Catherine had no easy answer, no rehearsed explanation that could soften the blow. Because this wasn't about a difference in opinion, this was personal. And the hand that had written it, Catherine now feared, belonged to someone far too close. Someone whose title protected them, but whose words had just pierced through the quiet dignity of royal tradition. She wrapped her arms around Louis, pulling him close. No words, just presence. Because there are moments when even queens in waiting are simply mothers, and some truths are too cruel to be named aloud. But Catherine knew this letter couldn't stay hidden any longer. It wasn't just ink on paper, it was a fracture. And while Louis didn't understand all the layers yet, he understood enough to feel the pain of them. Enough to ask the questions no one had dared voice. And soon, William would return to the place where it all began, and discover something even more disturbing beneath the room's carefully curated surface. One cracked frame, one unforgettable face, and across it, words scrawled so bitter, William could hardly breathe. The next morning, William returned to Clarence House, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate. He told the staff he needed to retrieve an old report, a harmless explanation, one that raised no alarms. But behind the composed exterior, his mind raced. Catherine hadn't described the letter in full. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes when she handed it to him said everything. And Louis, normally full of light, had gone quiet in a way that was unnatural for a child his age. Something had been taken from him, something sacred. And William needed to understand exactly what. He walked with silent purpose down the corridor, turning corners he had memorized years ago. But it was the door Louis had described, the one with the faint scent of lavender and something older, almost metallic, that stopped him. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. The air inside hadn't changed. It still clung to the skin, thick and perfumed, with a heaviness that made each breath feel borrowed. The room had been tidied since Louis's visit. The vanity straightened, scarves refolded, the jewelry box closed, but it hadn't been erased. Not enough. Not completely. And then he saw it. Near the window, partially hidden behind a ceramic vase, sat a photo frame. The glass was cracked clean through the middle, slicing the image in two. And within the broken frame was the face that had shaped his life, his loss, and the very mythos of the modern monarchy, Diana, his mother. The crack ran directly through her eyes and cheek, distorting her expression into something uncanny, as if even her image couldn't rest peacefully in this room. But it wasn't the broken glass that made his breath falter. It was what was written across it. In handwriting he already recognized. Sharp, narrow, controlled were the words, "Even broken, she still takes up space. Not loud, not vulgar, but cruel in a way only restraint can be." It wasn't grief. It was resentment. It wasn't mourning. It was a rejection. The kind that festers silently behind polite smiles and decades of forced coexistence. And in that instant, William understood. The letter Louis found, the torn journal page, the box, the silence. It all came from this place, from this room, and from someone who had lived too long in Diana's shadow without ever admitting the weight of it. He didn't touch the frame. He didn't need to. The words had already touched him deeper than any object could. This wasn't just about Charlotte, or Camilla, or even Louis. This was about legacy, and the war being waged beneath the surface of civility. This room wasn't a private chamber. It was a monument, not to memory, but to bitterness. And it had been carefully curated to contain what could never be spoken in public. A quiet rebellion, a personal reckoning, a place where resentment had found sanctuary. William stepped back, his pulse steady but his jaw tight. The photo stared back at him, his mother's eyes split by a crack, her legacy insulted by ink. He hadn't come for a confrontation, but now he had something worse. Clarity. Because the pain Louis carried home wasn't imagined. It had a source, and it had a name. But it wasn't just what he saw that haunted him. It was what he heard next that shattered everything. In a forgotten storage room, a flickering cassette player whispered a voice from the shadows and exposed a truth the monarchy had long buried. Just when William thought he had uncovered the full weight of what Louis had stumbled into, a quiet message arrived. No royal seal, no official signature. Only a handwritten note slipped into the morning stack by a trusted aide. It was from the housekeeper, not just any staff member, but one who had served the family through 3 generations. She asked him to return to Clarence House, alone. Her wording was careful, but her implication was clear. There was something else. Something she had found but wouldn't write down. And William, already reeling from the broken image of his mother and the bitterness scrawled across it, knew this wasn't something he could ignore. When he arrived, the housekeeper didn't greet him with ceremony. She simply nodded and led him down a quieter passageway, one even he barely remembered. Past familiar wings and behind a concealed panel, they arrived at a storage room, unmarked, unguarded, ordinary. It looked like any other utility space in a palace. Dusty shelves, labeled boxes, forgotten decades stacked like archived history. But it wasn't the boxes that mattered. It was what sat on the lace-covered stool in the middle of the room. A cassette player. Small, outdated, flickering with a single weak battery light. She gestured toward it without speaking, then stepped away. William sat down, pressed play, and everything he thought he knew about the silence inside that house shifted. There was no introduction, no timestamp. Only breath at first, then a voice quiet, controlled, unmistakably Camilla's. But this wasn't the voice of a queen. It wasn't rehearsed. I wasn't careful. It was raw. A woman speaking not to an audience, but to herself. And the intimacy of that truth hit harder than any confrontation could have. "They keep making space for her," Camilla whispered. "Even now. Every corner of this house still whispers her name." A pause followed. No hesitation, reflection. "I host, I smile, I survived, but I'll never be her, and I know that." The recorder clicked faintly as she shifted. "But they look at me and wonder why I try. I see it in their eyes. I see it in his eyes." Her voice broke slightly, then steeled again. "I look at that little girl Charlotte, and I see it. The softness, the grace. They'll love her like they loved Diana, and I'll be the shadow again." William's breath grew shallow. The letter, the photo, the broken frame. None of it was coincidence. None of it was accidental. This was not an act of impulse. It was a slow-burning resentment carved into the very walls of the house. The words on the tape weren't confessions. They were wounds, old ones, buried but never healed. And now, exposed not through rage, but through resignation. A quiet bitterness that had metastasized behind pearls and protocol. The recording ended not with a final sentence, but with silence. No goodbye, no conclusion, just emptiness. William didn't rewind. He didn't ask for the tape. He didn't say a word to the housekeeper waiting just beyond the door. He simply nodded. She had done her part. The truth had been delivered not as an explosion, but as a whisper that somehow cut even deeper. Now he knew what Louis had stepped into a house of echoes and a war of legacies. One joke about Queen Camilla, and Prince Louis shattered in front of everyone, revealing the depth of a wound no one had seen. The royal family had gathered for a private memorial service at Windsor, the kind that never reached headlines but carried the weight of centuries within its walls. It was meant to be a quiet, dignified afternoon, a gesture of remembrance, a return to order. The kind of event where children could run on freshly cut lawns and adults could sip tea in silence without the eyes of the world pressing in. And for a brief moment, it almost worked. The sun peeked through the clouds, Charlotte chased George through the hedges, and Louis smiled faintly under the gentle watch of his mother. But peace, in the royal family, rarely lasts long. And sometimes it unravels in the most unexpected ways. It began innocently enough. A longtime staff member, trying to lighten the mood, made a passing joke about Camilla. Something harmless, something soft. A story about her once attempting to bake and setting off the palace smoke alarms. Everyone chuckled. Even Catherine smiled politely. But Louis didn't. He froze. His shoulders tightened. And before anyone could notice the change in his expression, he bolted. Past the tea tables, through the gardens, disappearing into the thick hedges, with tears streaming silently down his face. It was sudden, raw, and jarring, and it broke the fragile illusion of normalcy they had worked so hard to maintain. Catherine was the first to follow, her mother's instinct already a step ahead of reason. She found him minutes later, curled in on himself between two hedges, body shaking, face buried in his arms. No pretense, no performance, just a child breaking in real time. She crouched beside him, calling his name softly until he looked up. His face was red, eyes swollen, voice cracked. "I don't want her to hate us," he whispered. 5 words that cut through centuries of royal stoicism like glass through silk. Catherine's heart ached, not just because he was hurting, but because he now believed he had to earn a love that should have been unconditional. She pulled him into her arms without hesitation, holding him close, smoothing the back of his shirt like she had done since he was a baby. "Louis," she said quietly, firmly, "we don't control what someone else feels, but we protect each other from it. Always." The words weren't rehearsed. They were born from instinct. From knowing that no title, no lineage, no bloodline could shield a child from the sting of exclusion. And as she held him tighter, he sobbed into her shoulder not because of what he had done, but because of what he now feared. William stood nearby, having witnessed the entire moment from a distance. He didn't move. He didn't interrupt. His arms were crossed, his gaze locked on his son with an expression that revealed nothing but carried everything. Because for all his power, William had been powerless to stop this. A letter, a photograph, a cassette, those were clues. But this was the cost. A boy too young to understand legacy, already carrying its scars. And suddenly, it became clear. The damage wasn't just in what Louis had seen, it was in what he now believed to be true. That he was unloved, unwanted, that his family, the very one meant to protect him, had been silently turned against itself. But this wasn't over. William knew he had to confront the storm not for answers, but for justice. She didn't deny it. She didn't explain it. But when William told Camilla what Louis had found, even the walls of Clarence House went still. He returned without fanfare, unannounced, unescorted. There was no need for ceremony now, only truth. The staff recognized the look on his face and said nothing. They knew better. Clarence House had seen its share of confrontations, but this one would not be loud. It would not be violent. It would be colder, sharper. The kind of exchange that doesn't end with shouting but with consequences. William made his way to the library, where Camilla often sought refuge from the palace's endless choreography. She was alone, a thin porcelain teacup in her hand, and a book she clearly wasn't reading resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, but her face didn't change. Not immediately. It didn't have to. He didn't sit, didn't greet her. He simply stood across from her and delivered the blow without hesitation. He found the letter, and he cried himself to sleep. His voice was steady, but underneath it pulsed the fury of a father whose child had been dragged into something far too dark. Camilla didn't flinch. She didn't pretend. She didn't ask what letter. Her fingers tightened slightly on the teacup as she exhaled. "It was never meant to be found," she said, her voice lower than usual, almost defensive, but not remorseful. There was no apology, only an admission that it existed, that it had always existed, that someone had simply opened a door they weren't meant to open. William took a step forward, the silence between them thick with the weight of everything unspoken. "You didn't just write a letter," he said, each word precise, cutting. "You left a scar, and not just on my son, but on this family." Camilla looked away for the first time, her gaze drifting toward the window. She didn't argue, but she didn't ask for forgiveness either. What she did say was even more chilling. "You have no idea what it's like," she murmured. "To live in someone else's shadow so completely. To know that no matter how hard you try, how long you wait, how much you sacrifice, you'll never be her." The word landed with force. Her. Diana. The ghost who still shaped every hallway, every comparison, every cruel headline. Camilla didn't say her name, but she didn't need to. William's jaw clenched. His eyes burned with something deeper than anger. "That's your burden," he replied, calm but blistering. "You don't get to hand that pain to my children. Not Louis, not Charlotte, not any of them." His words hung in the air, firm, final, a line drawn not in protocol but in blood. Camilla said nothing. She couldn't, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't cost her more than she was willing to give. William turned and walked toward the door, but paused before leaving. His voice was quieter now, but far more devastating. "He thought you hated us," he said. That's what he took home, not a letter, not a story, a belief. Camilla opened her mouth slightly, but the words never formed. Because this time, even she knew anything she said would be too little, too late. William left, the door clicking shut behind him like the end of a chapter no one would ever speak of again. But even silence speaks, and Camilla's silence in the days that followed spoke louder than any apology ever could. She didn't write, she didn't call, and in her silence, a choice was made, one that would haunt the monarchy's legacy forever. In the days that followed William's confrontation, Clarence House fell noticeably quiet. The usual rhythm of engagements, receptions, and small gatherings slowed, but not because of public obligations. It was internal, intentional. Camilla, once a constant figure in the palace's social choreography, began to vanish from sight. Her walks through the gardens became shorter, her presence in meetings more subdued. When she did appear, it was with an air of distance as though she was performing a role rather than living within it. And those closest to her noticed the shift. The warmth was gone. The practiced ease was replaced by something colder, mechanical. She smiled less. She spoke less. And when the names of Charlotte or Louis came up in conversation, she changed the subject without blinking. Behind palace walls, staff whispered carefully. No one dared to ask what had really happened, but they knew. They had seen the ripple. They had felt the stillness that settles only after something sacred has been fractured. Catherine, ever composed, waited quietly, patiently, with hope that perhaps there would be a gesture, a message, a note, some form of acknowledgement from the woman who had once insisted she wanted to be a grandmother to them all. But it never came, not in a letter, not in a call, not in the form of flowers or a softened glance at the next public appearance. Nothing. And so the silence became its own reply. Not a misunderstanding, not a delay, a decision, one made deliberately and left to fester. It was as if Camilla believed that by saying nothing, she could seal the damage behind a closed door and pretend it never happened. But silence, in a family so defined by duty and legacy, is rarely empty. It becomes a language of its own, one that echoes far longer than words. And in this silence, Catherine understood something devastating. Camilla hadn't simply failed to apologize, she had chosen not to. Camilla's days grew more withdrawn. She spent long stretches at her writing desk in the Rose Lounge, pen in hand, blank stationery in front of her. But no ink ever touched the page. Not for Louis. Not for Charlotte. Not even for William. She would stare out the window as though the city could offer an answer she couldn't give herself. And maybe she believed the distance would soften the wound. That time would smooth the jagged edges. But she was wrong. Because in families, especially royal ones, what goes unspoken becomes the loudest part of the legacy. No apology ever arrived, and with each passing day, it became clear that none ever would. Not because she didn't have the words, but because she couldn't bring herself to speak to them. And in that silence, she surrendered something far more permanent than favor or standing. She lost the last fragile thread of trust with the very children she had once promised to protect. But while the palace spun forward, behind closed doors, a little boy was still trying to make sense of the sadness he couldn't name. No headlines, no royal statements, just a mother, a father, and a child learning how to feel safe again in a world where shadows sometimes speak louder than crowns. In the weeks that followed, the palace carried on public smiles, official visits, the quiet machinery of monarchy moving as if nothing had fractured beneath it. But behind the stone walls of Adelaide Cottage, a different rhythm emerged. Slower, quieter. Louis, once a spark in every room, had dimmed. He still played, still laughed, still held on to moments of joy, but there was hesitation now. A flicker of something deeper behind his eyes. George noticed first. The protective older brother instinct kicked in almost immediately. He hovered more, offered his hand without being asked, glanced toward Louis before speaking whenever Camilla's name even risked surfacing. Charlotte, ever observant, said less but watched more. And Catherine saw it all. She saw how Louis paused at the mention of Grandma, how his shoulders subtly tensed, how his gaze flicked downward, as if bracing for something unpleasant. It wasn't just about what he had found, it was about what he now carried. A belief, unspoken but sharp, that something about him, about Charlotte, about them, wasn't wanted. One night, after the others had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nightly hush, Louis lingered beside his mother in the hallway. His voice was soft, uncertain. "Will she always not like us?" 5 words, but they held the weight of everything he hadn't said since that day in Clarence House. Catherine knelt beside him, meeting his eyes. "What someone feels doesn't define who you are," she said gently, firmly. "You are kind, you are loved, and you are enough, always." And in that moment, the tears he had been holding finally came. No outburst, no drama, just release, quiet, trembling, necessary. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face into her shoulder as the weight began to shift just a little. Catherine didn't let go, not until he did. And when William entered the kitchen moments later, drawn by instinct more than sound, he didn't need to ask what had happened. He simply joined them, kneeling, wrapping his arms around both of them, forming a circle that, for the first time in weeks, felt unbreakable. No palace, no power, just love. The world outside spun on. Photos appeared in papers, events were attended, but inside their home, healing became the priority. Not through grand gestures, but in the smallest things: reading together before bed, walking hand in hand through the garden, laughing at something silly at breakfast. They didn't speak of the letter. or the room, or the words written across a shattered frame. But they lived around them, aware of the space they occupied, the quiet fault lines they left behind. Because Louis didn't need a royal decree to move forward. He needed presence, he needed truth, and he needed the kind of safety that didn't ask him to forget, but allowed him to feel and be held in it. And though the story won't reach the front pages, what Louis found will forever remain a quiet fault line beneath royal carpets, proof that even in castles, some doors should never be opened. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.